those weird job stories that you hear from time to time. A friend of mine, a guy named Justin, had a job once that involved erasing old VHS tapes. This was only a few years ago. If you didn't know, VHS and audio tapes as well worked by having magnetic particles arranged along the strip of plastic tape, which meant you could basically erase the tape by running a magnet over it. This job was with a school district in one of those old industrial buildings where the district kept buses and old equipment. You forget sometimes how big a school district really is, how many people it employs, how much work it does, and how school districts have these facilities you don't even think of until you hear a story like this one. Justin's job was in the maintenance department, and he worked with an old man named Leroy. Leroy might have been 60 or he might have been 90. He was one of those people. He was small, wiry, just a tuft of white hair around his head. And it was Leroy who told Justin that his job was going to be erasing these old VHS tapes and storing them away. I should point out that this was long after DVDs had become a thing, so why they were erasing and saving VHS tapes was very unclear to Justin. He asked Leroy, and Leroy didn't seem to have a good answer, and the question definitely put him in a mood. He made it clear to Justin that the reason was none of his business, and if he wanted the job, he'd do the work without comment or inquiry. So, Justin, who needed the money, bit his tongue and went to work. The tapes were kept in a basement of this old building. Everything down there looked like it was from the 1950s. There were old fixtures, there were old school desks made of wood and cast iron, and there were auto parts strewn everywhere, even on the floor. And there was a constant drip, drip sound of water falling somewhere that Justin could never quite locate. Leroy showed Justin a room in the back, illuminated by a single bare bulb. There were 10 or 15 3-foot square boxes, each filled with videotapes, and Justin's job was to take each tape in turn, rub it front and back with a magnetic tool, and then put it back in the box. It made no sense, but Justin decided not to care. After all, as Leroy had pointed out, he was getting paid. Leroy left him there in the basement. Right after that, Justin looked up at the one window in the room. This being Minnesota and a basement, the window was insulated glass that was opaque. Everything seen through it was wavy and distorted. And just a minute after Leroy had left, a pair of legs appeared outside the window. Justin couldn't see who it was, but he could tell it was a pair of legs, and that they were just standing there. They stayed for the longest time. Finally, after 15 minutes or so, Justin got fed up. He marched up to the window, tapped on the glass with the magnet tool he was using, and called out, "Hey, what do you want?" Then, very slowly, the legs moved away. Justin went back to work, but everything about this situation felt wrong. The pointlessness of the job, Leroy's behavior, he didn't feel right about any of it. But, as we say, Justin did need the money, and it was certainly easy work. So after a little while, the jitters faded, and Justin settled in, working at a very slow pace. He had the idea that if he finished this job quickly, Leroy would just give him something equally pointless to do. So he slowed down and tuned out. He put in his earbuds. There was no Wi-Fi, and he was running low on data, so he decided to listen to the songs he had downloaded. After about 90 minutes on the job, Justin had gone through 2 of the boxes of tapes, and had started on the 3rd. Each of these boxes could fit 4 layers of tapes stacked on top of each other, and when he finished the first layer of tapes in this 3rd box, he found it. He uncovered a tape that wasn't black. Back in the day, you would occasionally see different colored VHS tapes, but the vast majority of them were black, especially ones you'd buy blank. This tape, though, was red. the moment Justin uncovered the red tape in the middle of the box, his phone stopped working, stopped right in the middle of a song. He got it out and hit play again. It played for another 10 or 15 seconds, then stopped. He tried to start the song a third time and it wouldn't play at all. He restarted his phone and this time got a minute of the song before it quit. And after the next restart, he hit play and his ears were filled with a shrill, loud whistle that almost struck him deaf. He ripped the earbuds out of his ears and practically threw his phone across the room. He stood, staring at it, then turned to look at the box of tapes. 30 or 40 VHS tapes, all black, except for one. And he was overcome by a weird shiver feeling. So he decided he was going to figure out the deal with the single red VHS tape. First, he set that box aside with the red tape on top. Then he opened all the other boxes and removed the tapes, stacking them in the middle of the floor into a giant cube. He just wanted to see every tape from every box and handle it too. And sure enough, all of them were black, except for that one. Justin thought for a while, and then moved decisively. He went to the red tape, picked it up, and erased it. And from his pocket where his phone was, he suddenly heard the sound of the song he'd been listening to. It started up right where it left off, and it played through perfectly. Justin put his earbuds in. He listened to that song and the rest of the album without any trouble at all. So after that, Justin calmed down. He relaxed and focused on the job. He even figured out that unboxing all the tapes made a certain amount of sense. It made it a lot easier to put the tapes back in order after he'd erased them. Justin did the work for 3 or 4 hours until Leroy finally came back. He looked nervous, uncomfortable with being there, and he asked Justin why he'd taken all the tapes out of the boxes. Justin pointed to the red tape, which he'd put on a shelf off to the side and not packed away. Leroy turned white. All the color drained from his face. And Leroy asked, "Have you handled that tape?" And Justin said, "Sure, I erased it already. It was in the 3rd box." And Leroy nodded very slowly. And then he said, "How do you feel?" Justin frowned. He didn't know what the question meant. "I feel fine," he said. Then Leroy pointed at Justin's hands and said, "'Cause you don't look fine." Justin looked down at his own hands and saw that they were coated in blood, and as he looked, he realized his palms and his fingers were covered with dozens of tiny cuts, and blood was not only pouring out of the wounds, it was all over his clothes. And before Leroy said anything, Justin wasn't even aware of it. He didn't remember being cut. He didn't remember any pain. He didn't remember any blood. He didn't remember anything. Justin starts having a panic attack, but Leroy took him out of the room to a sink and ran cold water over his hands. That seemed to help. At that point, Justin could see how many cuts he actually had. His palms looked like they were covered with red spider webs. He got pretty pissed off at that point. He demanded to know what's going on, and Leroy said, "I probably should have told you, but I was afraid if I did, we'd never have got the job done." "What job?" Justin demanded. "Erasing a bunch of old tapes?" Then Leroy explained everything. The tapes they had been erasing were security tapes, surveillance, from the high school back in the 1980s. For the longest time, the school kept an archive of all the past tapes. That was until the year with what Leroy called all the trouble. The story was, there was a group of kids at the high school who got into the occult. There were always occult books in the library, but this group got into it in a big way. This was when the internet was brand new and they could do their own research, and very few teachers understood what was going on. No one knew exactly who they contacted or what they got involved with. They only knew how it all ended, and they only knew that because of the surveillance system. And the particular tape that caught them in the act, the final act, was the red one. The tape showed these kids doing a ritual on a dark stairwell in the high school. They lit candles and formed them in a pentagram. Then they held hands in a circle around and started chanting something. And then, according to Leroy, the tape showed one of the girls levitating up off the ground. Then just as suddenly she began to scream and crash back to earth. The other kids in the circle freaked out and ran. The one girl just lay convulsing on the ground while a pool of blood spread out from underneath her. By the time one of the teachers got there, the girl had bled out. They say she had a wound in her chest that looked as if someone had punched a 1-inch hole right through her heart. Her heart somehow kept pumping for a full minute after the hole was put in. It pumped the blood right out of her. Well, obviously this shook up the school pretty badly. From the start, there were rumors about the security cameras and what they had recorded, and the one tape that supposedly captured it all. There were special school board meetings and reporters snooping around for weeks, and the district finally came out and said the tape had gone missing. But it was a lie. What had happened is they gave it to Leroy. Leroy was put in charge of hiding it. But as long as the tape was around, Leroy said, odd things kept happening. Leroy looked at Justin and said, "Truth is, you're the third person we've hired to do this job, to try and erase the tape. One died in a car accident, the other by suicide, both within 24 hours of handling that tape for the first time. So, they packed away the tape with all the others and just ignored the problem for 10 years. So long as no one came close to it, so long as no one handled it, nothing bad seemed to happen. But Leroy, he couldn't leave it alone. He was old, well past the age of retirement, but he couldn't leave this job without taking care of this one last little problem. Well, Justin said, "I erased the tape. I erased it for sure." And Leroy said, "There's only one way to be sure." So the two of them returned to the room with all the tapes. Leroy slipped on a pair of gloves and picked up the red tape from the shelf where Justin had placed it. He walked over to one corner of the room and opened a cabinet. Inside was an ancient TV with an equally ancient VCR. He put the tape in the machine and pressed play. At first, there was nothing but static. There were weird waves and strange sounds, just the kind of thing you'd expect from an erased tape, a tape that had had its electrons rearranged. Then, suddenly, the picture became clear. But the picture was not of a stairwell or of high school students. The picture was of the room they were in. It was of the two of them, Justin and Leroy, standing in front of the TV set, watching. It was as if the camera were across the room filming them. Justin even raised his left hand, and the version of him on the TV raised his hand just a moment later. At that point, Justin decided he had enough. He turned to Leroy to say something, but the version of him on the TV didn't move. Then he did. Justin on the TV pulled a straight razor from his pocket. He grabbed TV screen Leroy by the tufts of his white hair and sliced him open from ear to ear. All of this happening while Justin, the real Justin, stood and watched. Justin turned to Leroy. Leroy, the real Leroy, was already on the ground, nearly bled out. Justin looked down at his hands, still covered in blood. And he searched his pockets, and he searched the room. He even searched Leroy, but he never found a razor. Justin called an ambulance, of course, but Leroy didn't make it. He never had a chance. There was an investigation, but charges were never filed. After that, Justin was called into a meeting. He opened the door and found the school superintendent along with the mayor and the chief of police. They offered him a deal. They said they had the video evidence that he'd killed Leroy, but they wouldn't reveal it on one condition: that he go to work for the school district and guard that tape. Don't try and destroy it, they said. It can't be destroyed. That's the thing Leroy refused to accept. Just leave it be, and we'll leave you be. Justin works for the school district to this day. But the last time I talked to him, he looked terrible. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. And he said, "You know, maybe it's time we hire someone to come in and erase those tapes. It's a job that really needs